A united front for the United States. That's the Liberals' plan, the promised tariffs by President-elect Donald Trump and how they're going to tackle it.
I am also absolutely certain that the way we meet this challenge successfully is by presenting a united front, especially when it comes to our conversations with our American neighbors.
So that is Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland. Justin Trudeau saying last night's meeting focused on Canadian jobs, securing the border, and building on our strong partnership with the United States. But did the premiers get the answers that they were looking for? For more this morning, we're joined by CTV News Chief Political Correspondent Vassy Kapelos. Vassy, good morning.
Good morning, Anne-Marie.
During this meeting, we understand Ontario Premier Doug Ford says that he stressed that the federal government has been slow to react and is stuck on its back foot. That's what he said. He called for a more proactive approach from Ottawa. But did last night's meeting do anything to unite the premiers behind this Team Canada approach that the federal government says they want, which, by the way, sounds a little bit more like an Olympic team than a team about to head into a trade war?
Yeah, a little bit, right? I think time will tell. I'm not trying to escape the answer, but I honestly don't think that we know yet whether the Premier's concerns are going to be satisfied, because it's going to depend not just on what the Prime Minister said during that meeting and the comments from both of those ministers right after, and the sort of somewhat action plan that they announced. It's going to depend on whether they follow through on it and to what degree they do. I think that Premier Ford is reflecting something I heard from a number of premiers yesterday, which is that they wanted some specifics from the federal government. Remember, it was actually a few days before the tariff threat from Donald Trump that the premiers got together, sent a letter to the Prime Minister and said, we need some clarity on who's leading this file and exactly what you're going to do. And I think the tariffs just kind of upped the ante, the tariff threat rather, just really upped the ante for premiers. So they want to know specifically, like, what are you going to do to address border security, which seems to be the #1 concern from the former president? And then what else do you have in store to kind of get our message across to this incoming administration? I think some of the premiers are kind of going out on their own, and the federal government is warning against that. They would like a unified front, as you mentioned, but it's going to require them conveying to the premiers and then acting on a very specific action plan.
Well, it all comes down to trust, right? We heard Premier Danielle Smith, who, as Premier of Alberta, has a big stake in this game. The #1 exports to the U.S. is crude and oil and petroleum, and that is something that Alberta is a key supplier of. So she has a heavy stake in this game, and we know that Alberta on its own had been going down and having talks and negotiations in Washington. So what did she learn, or what does she feel any more satisfied after this meeting yesterday?
Well, I think there's two ways to answer that question, right? There's like what will pragmatically happen and then the politics of it. I think everyone watching will be familiar with the fact that Premier Danielle Smith, Premier Scott Moe, not exactly BFFs with the Prime Minister. They see the world in very different political ways and through very different prisms. And that especially applies to our resources in the oil and gas sector, which, as you mentioned, 60% of what the U.S. takes in is Canadian oil. So it's a big deal. It would cripple pretty much every province's economy, but it would really impact Alberta's economy. And so I think it is going to be the place to watch moving forward. I will say that Premier Smith has, like you mentioned, some connections. She had already in the past few months met with Robert Lighthizer, who was the USTR, the U.S. Trade Representative. His chief of staff has now been nominated. His former chief of staff has now been nominated to that position, so there's still a link there. She's met with Doug Burgum, who is the Minister of the Interior and will also kind of be the energy czar for the Trump administration. So you would hope that those connections keep going and that the message, is conveyed on behalf of Canada. The question will be, will it be on behalf of Canada, or will it be primarily on behalf of Alberta? Will she work to secure an exemption from the threat of these tariffs for oil and gas, or for all Canadian exports? I think that's where the fault lines, the tricky fault lines may lie. Like, every premier is very, very protective of what their province has to offer to the United States and the impact that it would feel. So, what does that mean for the action plan or the plan of attack, vis-a-vis President Trump? I think it's just different than it was 8 years ago, right?
Yeah, well, and so that brings up a really good point. So in his first administration, he wasn't as familiar, perhaps, in the beginning with the trade relationship back and forth between Canada and the U.S. He was learning a lot in his first administration. We're heading into a second administration. And although, we heard from the Deputy Prime Minister saying we need to remind the U.S. of the importance of this relationship, I think it's safe to say they already know. The numbers are there. They see the same ones that we do. So if it's a matter of being brought into Trump's trade tent, and he's made it clear this is about border and security. Legault has been saying this for a while. We need to shore up our border security. How do they prove that to the satisfaction of Donald Trump? How will they know when they've met that measure?
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. The threat of tariffs, though it's a punitive trade measure, has nothing to do with trade for Donald Trump. It's an instrument for him to be able to say he's got to win in some other area. And what is one of the primary reasons he was reelected to become president? It's issues around border security. And obviously, we are very focused on the southern border because of the sheer volume of illegal migration. I think in the last fiscal year, it was 1.5 million people illegally migrated over that border versus 23,000 in Canada. However, that 23,000 signifies a doubling in the northern border, which has caught the attention of Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, and therefore Donald Trump. And so whether we say, this isn't a big deal compared to Mexico or not, it's obviously a big deal to him. So I found it very interesting last night after the meeting, Public Safety Minister Dominic LeBlanc alongside Minister Freeland came out, and the Public Safety Minister said for the first time there are new resources that they plan to send to the border because they had been very vague since the threat was made. I have done a couple of interviews with ministers. We've shored up, we've fortified the border. There are resources. We're sending some helicopters, some drones, but no specifics. Why is the problem worse this year than it was last year? What exactly are you going to do to make that stop? They didn't present to the public, at least, specific plans when it came to that. So last night they did add some meat to the bone and said that there are more resources. I'll be looking to find out how many, what's the goal, how are you going to convey that to President Trump?
Yeah, I think President-elect Trump's looking for that too. Vashi, thanks for joining us this morning. Always great to talk to you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
If you liked that video, make sure to subscribe to the Your Morning YouTube feed where you can find all kinds of new content posted every weekday morning.